Between 1750 and 1900, something incredible happened. The world map was totally, radically redrawn. A few industrialized nations basically projected their power across the entire globe, building these massive empires through a mix of conquest, clever diplomacy, and sometimes just pure brute force. Okay, let's get into how this massive shift in global power actually went down.
So that's the big question, right? How on earth did this happen? What was pushing this insane wave of expansion? And, what did it actually look like on the ground? We're going to break it all down. So first things first, let's talk about what was driving all of this. This whole 19th century power grab was really fueled by another revolution that was happening at the same time, the Industrial Revolution.
Okay, let's look at the first model for how this expansion happened. This one wasn't really about sending tons of people to live somewhere new. Nope. This was all about controlling territory for cold, hard, economic, and strategic gain. Dominating key locations, vital trade routes, and of course, valuable resources. Now, to build these massive projects, these imperial powers often relied on a system that was just brutal. It was called corvée labor. Essentially, it was state-sanctioned forced labor. I mean, let's call it what it is, slavery by another name. The Suez Canal, this project that would completely change global trade, was built on the backs of 1.5 million Egyptians forced into this exact system. And here you can see exactly why that canal was such a big deal. When it was finished in 1869, it connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, creating this unbelievable strategic shortcut. For Great Britain, this was an absolute game changer. It literally slashed the travel time to their most valuable colony, India, and basically supercharged their control over all the Asian trade routes. So once this amazing shortcut existed, there was no way Britain was going to lose it. When things got a little politically unstable in Egypt, threatening their access, they didn't even blink. They sent in the military and set up what they called a protectorate, which is a nice way of saying they had total control without all the headaches of a formal colony. It was all about controlling that one strategic choke point. Now, another way to get control without the hassle of actually ruling a place was through a sphere of influence, and China is the classic example here. It was weakened by its own internal conflicts, so it wasn't fully colonized, but the European powers just carved it up like a pie. Each one claimed exclusive rights to trade and invest in different parts of the country. And this, of course, completely crippled China's sovereignty from the inside out. All right, so next, we've got a completely different model, the settler colony. Here, the goal wasn't just to control a territory from afar, it was to actually displace the people who were already living there and build a whole new society, basically from scratch. Two of the biggest examples of this are the United States and Australia, but they had very, very different beginnings. In the US, expansion was powered by this idea of manifest destiny, this sort of quasi-religious belief that Americans were destined to rule the continent from coast to coast. Australia's start was, well, a lot less glamorous. It was literally founded as a penal colony, a remote dumping ground for British convicts. The American expansion was incredibly systematic and often incredibly brutal. You had the Monroe Doctrine, which basically declared the Americas as the US's backyard. Then you had horrific events like the Trail of Tears, a forced removal of entire Native American nations, and the Mexican-American War, which ended with the U.S. seizing a gigantic chunk of territory that we now know as the American Southwest. Australia's journey was really different. Yeah, it started out as this remote prison, but then settlers figured out the land was perfect for raising sheep. Then copper was discovered, and then, the big one, gold in 1851. That discovery triggered a massive rush of immigration that completely transformed the continent from a jail into a booming, resource-rich settler colony. Okay, our third and final model is, well, it's something else entirely. This isn't really about state policy. It's about the unchecked personal greed of one single man. It's the story of how a territory bigger than all of Western Europe became one person's private piggy bank, leading to one of the worst atrocities of the entire era, the Congo Free State. And that one man was King Leopold II of Belgium. He actually convinced the world that he was setting up the Congo Free State for humanitarian reasons, to end the slave trade, to bring civilization. But in reality, it was a personal business venture, a private fiefdom designed for just one thing, to make him disgustingly rich. So to get all the rubber and ivory he wanted, Leopold's agents forced impossible quotas on the Congolese people. And if you failed to deliver, the punishments were just unimaginable. public floggings, taking wives and children hostage, and, most infamously, cutting off people's hands as proof that bullets weren't being wasted. This wasn't a colony. It was a continent-sized slave labor camp run with pure, systematic terror. The human cost it's almost impossible to comprehend. During Leopold's 23-year reign of terror, historians estimate that as many as 8 million Congolese people died from murder, starvation, and disease. 8 million.
And what was all that horror for? This, an estimated 220 million francs in personal profit for King Leopold. You put those two numbers side by side, the death toll and the profit, and that tells you the entire story. It was a genocide fueled by one man's greed.
So all of this competition, especially in Africa, it was quickly turning into a chaotic free-for-all. The European powers realized they needed a way to make their conquests official and, just as importantly, to avoid fighting each other. They needed to start drawing lines on the map. This wild period of intense competition is known as the Scramble for Africa. Starting in the 1880s, European nations were just racing to claim as much of the continent as they could, all driven by a thirst for resources, strategic advantages, and plain old national pride. And to bring some order to this chaos, they held the Berlin Conference. European leaders literally sat around a table and just drew lines on a map of Africa, creating brand new colonial borders. They did this with absolutely zero regard for the people who actually lived there, splitting up ethnic groups and forcing rival societies together into these new, totally artificial states. And the key detail, the one that tells you everything, not a single African representative was invited. But don't think for a second that imperial rule was just accepted. People fought back. There was resistance, sometimes successful, often not. In Ethiopia, for instance, Emperor Menelik II brilliantly led his forces to crush an Italian invasion, keeping his nation independent. In Siam, now Thailand, they cleverly played Britain and France against each other to stay neutral. But in so many other places, like China during the Boxer Rebellion, resistance was just brutally put down.
So, after all was said and done, what was the legacy of this 150-year power grab? Well, we were left with a world that was completely remapped, with lines drawn and histories rewritten by outsiders, creating consequences that, frankly, we are still living with today.
So let's just do a quick recap. Over this time, the old empires tightened their grip, while new players like the US and Japan got into the game, expanding their own influence using both war and diplomacy. But maybe the most lasting legacy of all was the creation of those artificial borders, especially in Africa, which basically became a blueprint for decades of future conflict. The end result was just a breathtaking redrawing of the map. I mean, think about it. A huge continent, home to thousands of distinct societies, was almost entirely carved up in just a couple of decades. By the year 1900, only 2 nations in all of Africa, Liberia and Ethiopia, were still independent. And that leaves us with one final thought. Most of these formal empires have been gone for more than half a century, but the political lines, the ethnic fault lines that were created by their borders, they are very much still with us. So the real question is, how do these lines, drawn by strangers in a faraway capital over 100 years ago, continue to shape conflict, politics, and identity in our world right now?